Welcome back to the DC Blockchain Summit. My name's Kevin Bate. I serve as the Policy Director for the Chamber. I'm also a partner in Delta Strategy Group, which is a DC-based government relations, government affairs firm. I'd like to introduce Blythe Masters. She's the CEO of Digital Asset Holdings, a New York-based distributed ledger technology company. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Digital Asset Holdings. They're doing some cutting-edge work in the distributed ledger space, which you'll hear more about today. Blythe is also the chairman and of the governing board of the Linux Foundation Hyperledger project, and a member of the International Advisory Board of Santander Group, and an advisory board member of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. Blythe previously served as a senior executive at JP Morgan, where she built their commodity business. As a recovering derivatives lawyer myself, I'm probably personally most impressed with the fact that she's widely credited with having created the first credit default swap. Blythe is also an accomplished equestrian. And joining her for this fireside chat is someone who doesn't need an introduction to this group, Perry-Ann Boring, the founder and CEO of the Chamber. So please welcome them for our next panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And Blythe, thanks again for joining us at the summit.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Great turnout.
Yeah, and despite the snow, we seem to make it work.
Well, I was in Boca yesterday, and it was better there. So
FIA clearly had
I was tempted to claim that I couldn't make it here, but unfortunately, there's a few others that have made it from the same venue, so I think I might have been called out on that.
The past year has been an incredible year for you and for Digital Asset, and you were on the same stage exactly a year ago, and you had just announced your $60 million funding round. Again, congratulations. I know you're still kind of going on the tailwinds of we've raised all this money, now what's the next step? And you've traveled all over the world. Two of the most, as I see, as the most impressive projects that you're managing are with ASX and the DTCC. So let's first start with ASX. What have you accomplished in the past year? I've seen they've invested even more into the company, and you've got through a couple different phases of your project. So what have been the greatest accomplishments with ASX over the past year?
Well, I spent 2 weeks in an airplane last year, either on the way back from or on the way to Australia. So I think that counts as an accomplishment, because it takes 24 hours to get there and 24 hours to get back. You go there 8 times in a year, and it's more than 2 weeks at a plane. But seriously, it has been quite a significant journey over a relatively short period of time. So we're now more than a year into the project that we're working on together. The project has phases, as you would expect. We built a prototype that was conceptual in a competitive phase, then a more hardened prototype, which was delivered in the summer of last year, in June. That was to help facilitate ASX and its board make a decision to continue the project and further explore the viability of the technology. By the end of last year, so in November, we had completed the process of fully specifying the requirements, both functionally and non-functional requirements, for what will be a production-ready deployment of DLT software by December of this year. And as we speak today, we are on track in terms of what needs to be delivered over that period of time to make that realistic. That's not to say that ASX has yet made a decision definitively to proceed with replacing its existing infrastructure for clearing and settlement of cash equities with this technology. That decision won't come until after we deliver a production-ready, testable system in December. And then the process of actually, if they and when, or when they make that decision, the process of how they roll that out with their customer base, the various regulatory approvals and other things, won't start until then. So, but the objective is to put them in a position to be able to make that decision by that time.
And one key point, you mentioned the regulators, and obviously this is a heavily regulated industry. So what has it been like, the experience working with the regulators there? Do they see the benefits of this? You're building an enterprise-grade distributed ledger technology solution. So how are the regulators being receptive to this? What is the process to get? Is there approvals you have to get?
Yeah, so I mean, I won't just talk about ASX's regulators, because I think the answer to the question applies more broadly, and I also don't want to suggest that ASX's regulator or regulators that are relevant in this context, or any others, at least to my knowledge, have yet been presented with the question, do you mind if we run your national market infrastructure on this piece of kit? And been asked to say yes or no. You generally shouldn't ask that kind of question whether, unless you know the answer in advance. There's a lot of prep work has to go into that. And so there is an ongoing journey, which of course the Australian regulators are deeply involved in, but so are many others, of essentially an educational understanding, which usually starts with an impression that's created from the media and elsewhere that blockchain technology is this thing that the Bitcoin blockchain is, and it involves explaining the very many differences and different design choices that have been needed to be made in order to make something suitable for large-scale wholesale financial markets regulated activity. So that's usually the first part of the process. The second part of the process is that answering the questions whether there are any legal, regulatory, or God forbid, sort of acts of Congress type changes needed to enable the deployment of this technology, which usually gets simplified by the observation that actually really all we're talking about here is a change in database architecture, a significant one, but that is really what this boils down to in that context. And when you get the conversation away from, what about the public Bitcoin blockchain and cryptocurrency and anonymity and all of the features that obviously won't work for these applications, and get it back down to, okay, well, we use databases today, and this is a new database architecture with some significant security enhancement around it. The pressure in the room kind of drops, and it becomes a more relaxed interaction, if you will. And so I would say, if you go talk to any of the major securities regulators in the world, they're all familiar with the work of IOSCO. IOSCO put forward its principles for operating market infrastructures, voluminous framework that essentially offers you a roadmap that is more or less embraced by all global securities regulators as to what you need to comply with if you want to run an infrastructure that could interfere with the economy if it breaks. And it lays out the requirements for resiliency and redundancy and auditability and the rule of law and managing credit risk and managing operational risk and so on and so forth. And that roadmap provides you actually with exactly the questions and the answers that need to be asked and answered before a regulator is going to get comfortable with whether a new technology deployment in that context is okay. They therefore have already the authority and the power and the pre-existing criterion for what it takes to run these kind of high fidelity, high throughput, high capacity, systemically consequential systems. And if you don't have good answers to those questions, then it's going to be a short conversation. You kind of go back to square one and start the conversation over again.
Yeah, there's definitely some non-starters there.
Yeah, the tone has changed very, very significantly. I, again, don't want to suggest that we've gotten to the point where anyone has been asked to sign off definitively, but the process of evaluating what would need to be done is much better understood now than I think it was even a few short months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And here at the Chamber, of course, we're a nonprofit organization. We're not building any particular type of solutions or trying to sell them to anybody either. But we are engaged in the policy discussions and and being that interface between our members and government. And so much of what we do, which is basic education.
Exactly.
What is this technology? How does it work? And we've made a ton of progress over the past several years.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Very nice job. Just look at this.
Thank you.
Carrie Ann, not so boring.
Yes, that's true. I joked yesterday, my entire family is here, my mom and my dad.
I know, I met her. She's told me all about you.
You met
Yeah, she's in the green room. I said, your daughter's a force of nature. She said, yeah, has been for a while.
Yeah. they hold all my trophies. I can't even fit them in my apartment here from all the activities I did as a kid. But I joked yesterday, I said this is by far the most boring blockchain conference you've ever been to, because they're all here.
This is more fun than the conversation was yesterday in Boca.
Another member company of the Chamber is the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. Of course, Rob.
Nobody ever calls them that.
The DTCC, yes.
They're all about the acronyms.
Yeah. Well, in DC as well. But you guys have a huge project with the DTCC as well, and it's also going, it sounds like it's going very successful with repo transactions, and you all put out a press release. Phase 1 was successful. You're now moving into phase 2. So what did we learn in phase 1, and what is the next step for the project?
So I'm conscious that Rob Palatnik is sitting over there and will be on the next panel, so to make sure I get this right. But I would say a couple of things. When this technology was in its early phases, there was a lot of commentary, which I think was probably largely pretty fair, that it felt very often like it was a technology that was looking for a business problem, and really successful technologies should start with your business problem and respond accordingly in solving that problem. And what I find a key characteristic for a really successful project is that not only is the technology fit for purpose and potentially can offer some benefits that are unique and particular to the technology itself, but if it can also solve an unrelated business problem that is causing other problems very effectively, then you've got a significant motivation for a project to progress. And what I would say about the DTCC use case is that it is solving a very real-world problem that has not so much necessarily to do with DLT, the generally understood benefits of DLT per se, but a simple issue, which is that if you look at the US Treasury repo market today, it has a bifurcation in it at the very front end of the market. So if you enter into a repo transaction whose on leg it occurs on the same day as the trade date, as in later on today, it is not possible to net that and centrally clear it through the FICC entity, another four-letter acronym but associated with DTCC. It is not possible to net that transaction with the rest of the FICC cleared book, including, for example, the off leg of yesterday's similar transaction. And if you think about that, the correlation between those two things, from a potential missed netting benefit point of view, is enormous. The consequence of that is a huge inflation of balance sheet for the participating dealers. And in the old days when balance sheet was not quite such a scarce commodity, when the infrastructure built around this market was created, nobody really cared. But in today's world, that results in attracting an enormous amount of capital that, it's very, very material. Just the return on which capital is measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars per annum across the street in the aggregate. So in answer to your question, finally rolling back to it, what we did, amongst other things, in the first phase of the project was to evaluate how using this technology to allow speeding up the process of executing, confirming, and clearing same-day repo transactions would actually reduce the balance sheet of the street. And the analysis that was done as a product of that created an overwhelmingly powerful business case for this project to progress due to the savings that will be delivered to DTCC's customers. So not only obviously did we kick the tires, or did DTCC kick the tires of the technology and the architecture, but they found a really nice use case that needs fixing, whether it be with DLT technology or otherwise, that pays for itself, generates benefits for everybody. So that's what we got done in phase one. And now we're in a formal requirements gathering and stakeholder working group engagement process, which is getting into much more detail of what DTCC's customers need from the technology itself.
And most of the stakeholders and the participants, of course, are the banks themselves.
Mm-hmm. The customers of DTCC, yeah.
So let's talk about how this is going to affect the banks, whether members of DTCC or banks in general. And I sit on an advisory board for the North Carolina State Bank regulator, and I've spent some time with the North Carolina banks, much smaller than some of these other customers. But in our meetings, there's this. Some of them are very scared. They're very confused. They're not quite sure how this is going to affect the business models. You hear out there this is going to disrupt banking, and banks are going to be totally different. But how do you see, how is this going to affect banking, let's say 5, 10, 15 years out? What are those models going to look like? What is the core business of banking going to look like?
Well, that isn't going to be determined solely by distributed ledger technology by any means. Actually, I think some of the changes that are ongoing in and around Washington from a policy point of view could have a bigger implications for that than merely the advent of this technology. I had the privilege to be sitting in the wings yesterday in Boca when the newly nominated CFTC chairman, Giancarlo, spoke. And a few of you in the audience were there, but it's been a long time, and it may in fact be that it's never been the case that a representative of the CFTC, chairman-elect or otherwise, got a standing ovation from that crowd. These are hardcore derivatives people at the FIA, and he did, and it was talking a lot about...
We would have got one here too.
Oh yeah? Okay, great. So it's good to hear. So, that was change in tone is going to drive more of, I think, implications in the near term, especially for the smaller institutions that have struggled with the cost of compliance with a raft of regulation which really wasn't designed for smaller banking institutions. I think bigger picture, the original vision for blockchain technology obviously arose in the aftermath of the financial crisis, disillusionment with the financial intermediary industry broadly, not just banks, but especially banks. And it was envisioned as being a means to essentially eliminate intermediaries who were deemed somewhere between evil and redundant, depending on how unkind you wanted to be, allow the world to interact directly on a peer-to-peer basis and eliminate the need for all intermediation. I think that vision obviously didn't fall on particularly fertile ground in terms of how it was received by the banks, but the world has moved on now, and a much more likely outcome is that banks and others will adopt and embrace this technology, much like everybody adopted and embraced internet technology and other things that have come along in recent years, and use it to perform higher value-added services at lower cost with greater efficiency and less inherent risk in the system than they do today. Because the reality is that banks do a lot of things. Some of them are not particularly highly value-added and involve the processing, post-trade processing and reconciliation and inefficiencies associated with what we're trying to tackle with distributed ledger technology. But banks also provide and are needed to provide an engine of growth for the economy. They lend, they make markets, they provide liquidity, they provide advice, they offer a trusted regimen and a highly regulated environment. And all of those activities, to varying degrees, have value, which can be delivered at lower cost with more efficacy to their customers by embracing technology that allows them to do that stuff better and to focus their resources on where they can add the value as opposed to ticking and tying, redundant, duplicative, separately maintained records of activity that actually should be the same record of activity, and which of course is the promise of what blockchain can achieve. So I don't see blockchain technology putting all banks out of business. I think the banking industry structure is changing for other reasons. I actually think that this technology, by virtue of enabling the release of capital and the reduction of costs, will actually enable banking business models which today are facing an existential threat to survive as opposed to be wiped out. And I know that feels like a little bit of a heretical inversion of the original intent of what the public Bitcoin blockchain was all about, but it's just a technology, it's just a tool.
You have a very global perspective of this technology as well. You sit on the board, an advisory board to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, I believe Hong Kong, I have a list of them.
A few of them.
Hong Kong as well. You have clients all over the world. We are here in DC, and the United States probably has the most complicated financial markets and regulatory environment. Where do you see blockchain adoption really taking off? What countries are getting this right?
I mean, there are some that started earlier, some that have more natural ingredients that make change easier because of the nature of the market structure in their jurisdiction. But my overall observation would be that this is a very, very global phenomenon. If you just look, for example, at the work of the Hyperledger Foundation, one of its most active working groups is in and around China, for example. With representation from all over the world, from Europe, Australia, Asia, and of course the United States. So, this is a technology that has no borders, or has the capacity to have no borders. That's not necessarily an appealing feature, depending on the context of who you're talking about using it with or for. But I think part of its power is that it's unifying, much like the internet itself was unifying in certain respects. So I wouldn't pick out any one area as being clearly dominantly ahead. I would say Australia obviously has a unique set of market circumstances that created the opportunity for them to move quickly. It's a very concentrated market. It's a dematerialized market, so already uses electronic records of securities ownership instead of paper records. It has a post-trade infrastructure that's aging, 20 plus years old, programmed in COBOL, which they don't teach in schools any longer, needs to be replaced, one way or the other. So I think, that's a reason why in Australia the work came early. But there, just look at my ML's account indicates that every corner of the globe is active at this point.
I mean, that's encouraging, because one of the fears I have is in the United States is if we don't get it right, you'll see innovation leave and potential brain drain, and maybe the U.S. will miss out. So there's still hope.
Yeah, I think, if we're sort of trying to raise the conversation up to a slightly more strategic level, I think one of the least often discussed, certainly at conferences like this, where we're deep in the weeds of DLT, is one of the least often discussed issues associated with this technology, like many other technologies, robotics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all this stuff, is what are the public policy implications from an employment point of view? And because the technology has the potential to put a lot of people out of jobs that are in relatively low value-added functional activities, we're not talking the sort of 5 or 10% percentage of populations that any well-disciplined organization will naturally try to squeeze out of its processes in any given year, just to be disciplined. We're talking about 30, 40, 50, 60% type reductions in certain activities, which will be rendered simply redundant by the simple fact that people are able to share securely a common record of something that today they keep separately and then have to fart around reconciling, right? And that raises questions about where do those jobs go? Just like when Uber disrupts the taxi and limousine services. Initially the disruption is to the dispatchers and the corporations, but medium term that's going to be to the drivers, because Uber's going to be having driverless vehicles, and what does that mean for employment consequences? So I think one of the biggest public policy decisions is going to be around the recreation of jobs, and the obvious and, in my opinion, only solution to that is a ruthless focus on education in science, technology, engineering, and math. And whether the U.S. gets that and delivers on it or not, it's going to be a very interesting observation as to the obviously job-creating focus of this new administration. It will be interesting to see whether that vision of what needs to happen is something that gets focused on, or whether we rely on other more defensive things like trade wars, which won't necessarily in the long run, in my humble opinion, get us there quite so effectively as focusing on education. But anyway, I changed the subject, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, as an economist, I get the question a lot, is how is this going to affect jobs? And no matter what the technology is, I would say it's going to raise the standard of living for all, and that's actually a good thing. And when we met with Janet Yellen last year, she invited us to give a presentation to all these central bankers around the world, and it was one of the first times I had heard her talk about blockchain in a positive way. And what she said to all the central bankers, her peers, is learn everything you can about this technology. And the reason, and the example she gave, she said fintech has raised the standard of living of industries in the past. And the example she gave was derivatives and in agriculture, and how that's completely changed the life of farmers and those who work in the agriculture industry. So if we can find a distributed ledger bot that can run the chamber, and if I can go retire, that would be great.
I'm taking that exit before you do, so I've got a few more years in than you do, I'm afraid. But I'm with you.
Yeah. Well, you probably could have retired, and you
well, I did kind of try to. That didn't work out. Yeah. I had one of those aha moments where a big enough idea comes along and kind of pulls you back, sucks you back in.
Don't want to miss out.
Yeah. This was too interesting to miss.
Well, time for one last question, and I think this is a good segue into that. In terms of competition, and this industry is growing incredibly fast. I mean, just at the conference, we've had multiple companies give multiple announcements. It seems like almost every week there's a new blockchain startup that starts, or they've raised huge amounts of funding. So how do you see the competitive landscape, and how do you all deal with it?
Well, it's funny, I got a very similar question yesterday in Boca, but with the sort of opposite lead-in, which is, a year ago everyone was fanatical about blockchain and the hype was insane, and now it all seems that it's much more negative, and nobody really wants to talk about it so much. And I got that both as a panel question and a.
Well, we're sold out, so people are listening.
And I got it from a couple of chaps in the press, and my opinion is that what's going on now is that we're in the process of graduating as an industry. Actually, there was a lull in fundraising for a while, but let's bear in mind there was a lull in overall fintech fundraising opportunity, and that has really again begun to pick up. But what in fact is really going on is people have their heads down and they're working. There's a stage and a phase where you need to generate attention because you're delivering an evangelical message that you need to pay attention to this. This is a big idea. It could change your world. preferably, it's not going to end your existence is probably not the best way to do that. That's where we started. We evolved. That message got nuanced and improved. Here is, it wasn't too hard to figure out how to do better than that, but here is an opportunity that is both a threat and an opportunity, but it's a bigger opportunity than a threat. So we've got to that stage. And during that time, you need to, the hype, that's what happens. You're actually looking to create hype because that's what gets people to pay attention and invest the resources and so on. Speaking for my own company, we're now over 100 people. More than 2/3 of that are engineers and product people, and it is a company that is 100% focused on delivering, period, end of subject, delivery. And that, you've less time for press releases and marketing and excitement when you're doing that, and obviously that is where the rubber will meet the road. People talk a lot about, going into production. There's a big difference between going into production in a, for example, bona fide, great use case, but record keeping or trade reporting or document coordination, where if that thing breaks, it's not going to be the end of the world, versus replacing systemic market infrastructures where if that thing breaks, heads roll and there are implications that are economy-wide. And that's the standard that we collectively as an industry have to get this technology to in order to see it really create something foundational that will release the big gains and the big benefits that will ultimately flow through to your man on the street who deserves to get an extra 50 basis points on his savings so he actually has a chance of retiring comfortably at some point. And that, that's where the industry is trying to get to now. And you think that 2 years ago you couldn't even get a meeting because if the word Bitcoin got on somebody's calendar and their boss read it, they'd get fired. And here we are today. We've come a long way, and it's I think it's a very exciting time, and I'm not surprised that you're sold out and that there's such a great audience here because it's real. It's not just about the hype anymore.
And they say if you want to get something done, hire a woman. So, so thank you for joining us.